Today we are building and painting a dinosaur. We got a big 1/24th scale Tyrannosaurus Rex model from Pegasus Hobbies. It is, I didn't measure it, but it's good 16 plus inches from snout to tail. And it is made out of vinyl PVC, and it is very, very heavy. This is one chunky model. I decided to narrate over this build rather than use my regular on-mic audio because the audio wasn't great, and I kind of wanted to truncate this a bit and just hit the highlights. So putting the kit together was fairly easy. It's only a few parts, but we do have seam lines that we have to deal with, and trying to cover seam lines on a textured surface is very difficult. I used epoxy putty and put that into the lines and try to use a toothbrush to do a little bit of stippling work to get the pebble pattern back. But what worked out a little bit better is I made stamps with green stuff over another area of the model, and just used that to stamp into the epoxy putty, and that helped to fill the gap and also create that nice surface texture on the model. The kit does come with a small base and also a little Triceratops victim. However, the base is definitely not beefy enough for the weight and size of the T-Rex. So instead I got a round base from a craft store, just cheap pine wood. It's perfectly fine when it comes to if you're going to paint it afterwards. It's about 8 or 10 inches. I think it's an 8-inch base. But first covered with some air dry clay mixed with white glue just to build up a rough surface and a place to insert the Triceratops. And then to cover that up a bit more, I switched to some spackle. And that was after gluing down some bark that's going to be to represent rocks. To give the spackle a little bit more texture, I went over it with an old toothbrush. Also, I worked in some gravel as well, just sprinkled it on and then stamped it in place. In hindsight, I really should have used paper pulp instead. I don't know why I went with spackle. I had something else on my mind, I guess. And that gives a lot more of a rough, kind of natural dirt surface than the spackle. Starting off with the paint and beginning with the T-Rex himself. And one thing you're going to notice here, this is very awkward to work on because this is a very heavy kit and it is very long. So just trying to keep everything in shot, or even just getting into the airbrush booth, was extremely difficult. So we're going to be doing about 5 different coats with the airbrush here, starting with the lightest color, and then we're going to move to darker colors, working our way towards the back of the creature. With the airbrushing done, you can see it's time to move on to the dry brushing, and it should be obvious that I'm not doing standard highlighting and shading here. Because of the size of this piece, it's large enough that the natural room light will cast the somewhat appropriate highlights and shades. So the main purpose here is just adding color, getting subtle color variations in the skin, and we continue that with the dry brushing just to get some unique colors. Like I said, we're not necessarily concerned with just mixing up the lighter shade of what we used previously. Want to add a little bit more green here, a little bit more brown there. Just whatever I can do just to make the whole piece look just much more visually interesting and pleasing to the eye. Part of the idea of keeping this looking like a real creature is all those little variations, and I actually started to paint individual scales on this T-Rex, and I quickly realized that's not going to work because I don't have 4 months of spare time to paint individual scales on this giant model. Instead, I went with some sponge techniques and tried to paint a little bit of a pattern on the back, following the same pattern that we did with the lines with the airbrush. Kind of enhancing that or disguising that in a few places. Again, just mixing it up so it looks a bit more interesting. And then that same concept we take over to the washes as well, just mixing in a few interesting colors into a little bit of the recesses. I try to go for the wrinkled skin or just get a bit of color variation between 2 areas where there was already a distinct color, for example, between the leg and the underbelly area. I tried to keep the T-Rex separate from the base as long as possible. Unfortunately, eventually I was going to have to attach it because the feet needed to be worked into the base and to the Triceratops as well. It took a lot of putty work to kind of blend those together because the foot did not fit very well. There was also the issue of me rubbing paint off of the T-Rex just by handling it. And I did take precautions like trying gloves and varnish, but still, the paint does not stick to PVC super great, so it was still coming off. But anyway, we're going to start painting our T-Rex victim pretty much the same way as the T-Rex itself. However, we're using a regular brush because we can't use the airbrush here. Also keeping a bit more of a simple paint job for him because I want him blended into the base. I don't want him to be very bright and colorful because I want the surface, the attention to be focused on the T-Rex and not the food at the bottom. So we're going to go with greens mostly for him so he blends a little bit better into the eventual base colors. between all of our yellow and greens, mixing in a little bit of tan earth just to give the transition layer between those two colors. So we go from yellow, a little bit of a brown color, and then we go into our full-on green. Finally, we get to the fun and most important part, and that is the oil paint wash. And we're using two colors here, raw umber for the darker area along the spine, and then raw sienna, which is a bit more orange. We're going to work that along the sides and a little bit into the bottom. And we're using an oil wash here rather than acrylic because the oil wash has a nice slow drying time, so we can actually blend those two colors together, and also once it's dry we can go back and just very easily wipe off any excess with some Q-tips or a cloth towel, and you can just see how it just sinks right into the recesses and really makes that pebble skin texture pop. The base began with some Vallejo Panzer Aces dark mud, and at first I tried dry brushing a little bit of, I forget what this was, let's call it rocky sand. Doesn't really matter because it really didn't work out. Actually, I think it might be khaki now that I think about it. But it didn't work out because the base is a bit too smooth to dry brush. Again, I really should have used some paper pulp instead. However, to bring out the look of the base, what we're actually going to go with instead is very heavy washes, and I mean really thick washes. So, you know, this is almost good enough could almost be a base coat. Consider a very thin base coat. So this is going to give us a little bit of color variation on the base without having to resort for dry brushing. And we're going to work a little bit into the green area. Once again, we painted the Triceratops green so it would blend into the base. Putting this color, the olive drab, all over the base, and then we'll start working in some darker greens into a bit more of the recessed areas of the base where more moisture might collect. Initially, I had really big plans for the foliage on the base. I was going to use some photo etch plants and some laser cut paper plants, but I realized they wouldn't fit because the base I made was just too small, and I couldn't put any real large prehistoric giant looking plants like I wanted because there just wasn't really a place to logically put them without obscuring the feet of the Triceratops. So instead I had to go for smaller foliage using a lot of Warlord Games grass tufts and also some moss that I've used on numerous projects that was soaked in glycerin for a few days and then allowed to dry out. That prevents the moss from drying out over time, at least in theory. Also tried getting some fake plastic plants that you can see here, and I was going to try putting those on, but again, just too big. And they really didn't fit with the more realistic looking grass tufts and moss. Since I did not have room for large plants, we had to go for something much smaller to fill in little gaps in the model, and went with leaf litter instead, and made essentially a slurry of leaf litter mixed with white glue, water, and I was supposed to mix in some matte medium as well to get rid of the gloss from the white glue, but I forgot that part. But it's no big deal because we're gonna matte varnish the model anyway. But just try to smear this on in any low-lying areas or any areas where leaves might collect. I felt my greenery still needed a little bit of height to kind of match it with the T-Rex, at least a little bit. And I went shopping, and the only thing I could find locally at the moment were cattails from JTT, which worked out pretty good. I was looking for like tall grass or something, and I just couldn't find it, and I couldn't order it online and get it in time. But it added a little height to the base, and all I had to do was just drill small holes into the base. Again, would have been better if I did that before doing all the painting, but just add a little bit of white glue and just slid them right into the hole, and that was about it. And there we go, one flat varnish coat later, and our T-Rex is complete. And as you can see, it's not on the regular tabletop turner because it won't fit. It's just too damn heavy and too damn big. I tried to cover as much as I could in this video. Unfortunately, just because this thing was so big and heavy and very awkward, a lot of things I just couldn't shoot because my setup here was not prepared for it. Like, for example, painting the mouth. Couldn't see anything while I was painting it. I really needed to have the camera level or shooting up at the mouth, and I just couldn't do that. This is not the biggest model I ever worked on, but I think I would call it one of the most awkward because of the shape and the size of the weight. Working on it was just really difficult, especially once I had to attach it to the base. Everything just became very awkward. If I were to do this project again, I would probably try to concentrate a little bit more on the base, make it a little bit larger so I had room to work in some what we would assume be more prehistoric looking kind of a jungle setup with, you know, big leafy ferns or something like that. But overall, it's done. Did something new for a change, and I hope you enjoyed it. So thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
This baby can handle everything but a three-headed oh, son of a... Oh.